Welcome back, Anatomy and Physiology. This is the last video of the Unit 2. We're going to finish up talking about the different types of tissues, and today's video is about muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and then we're also going to briefly talk about how our body fixes these tissues if they were injured. Let's first talk about muscle tissue. And muscle tissue is found in your muscles and produces movement. Two things that you probably already know. The unique characteristic about muscle tissue is that it's elastic and can contract. Muscle tissue, is able to change shape and change sizes to produce the movement. There's three types of muscle tissues. The first muscle tissue I want to talk about is skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is the muscles that are connected to your skeleton, to your bone, and is what you and I can control voluntarily to produce movements. The unique characteristic about skeletal muscles is that it has striations, it has stripes, which I'll show you in the next PowerPoint slide. Also, skeletal muscle cells have more than one nucleus. Remember, when we're looking at these tissue samples under the microscopes, the blobs, the dark blobs, are usually a nucleus. And so when you're looking at skeletal muscle under the microscope, you usually can see multiple dark blobs for each muscle cell. Okay, and then obviously, skeletal muscle is connected to some sort of connective tissue so that it can be connected to the bone. So here's an image of some skeletal muscle. And what I want you to look at first is that you can see some fibers running left to right on the slide, right? And if you look at each muscle fiber, there are several dark blobs in each muscle fiber. Each one of those is a nucleus. That's very unique to skeletal muscle. Well, also, if you look at each muscle fiber, there's some stripes that run top to bottom. Those stripes, which we call striations, do have a purpose, which we'll learn about in Unit 4 when we go over muscles and how muscles actually contract. But this is very unique, and something that you can see under the microscopes are these stripes that run up and down on the skeletal muscles. Another type of muscle tissue is the cardiac muscles. Cardiac muscles also have those stripes, those striations. However, they only have one nucleus per muscle cell. And then obviously cardiac muscle doesn't connect to bone like in skeletal muscle. Instead, they connect to other cardiac muscle cells. Because cardiac muscle cells do not connect to bone, rather connect to each other, they connect to each other through these dark bands called intercalated discs. This is what makes cardiac muscles very unique under the microscope, is that they have these dark bands throughout the tissue where the cells all connect and bind with each other. Now the purpose of cardiac muscle is to pump the blood. Of course, this is an involuntary movement. This is not something that you and I can control, that it just kind of happens on its own. Here is a picture of cardiac muscle under the microscope. Again, if you look at it closely, you can see the muscle cells running left to right. And you can see that there's really only like one dark purple blob per cell. Remember, it only has one nucleus per muscle fiber. And then if you look at each muscle fiber, there are some striations that run up and down. Okay, but then what makes cardiac muscles super unique are these intercalated discs, these bands, these dark bands that run sporadically through the sample of tissue, where the muscle cells meet up and bind to each other. These intercalated discs, if you see that under the microscopes, then that just screams that it's cardiac muscle. The last type of muscle tissue is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle does not have those striations like in skeletal and cardiac muscles. It doesn't have the stripes. Like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle only has one nucleus per cell, and it's connected to other smooth muscle cells. And you find smooth muscle in the hollow organs. A hollow organ is just an organ that's empty, that has an opening. Some examples would be your stomach, small intestines, large intestines, your uterus, your bladder. All of these organs contract and churn for this reason or that. You know, your stomach churns the food that you and I eat. Your small intestine contracts to propel the food along its way. You know, your bladder contracts to eliminate urine. All of these contractions and movements of these hollow organs are controlled by smooth muscle. Now, when you look at smooth muscle under the microscope, again, there is only one cell per muscle, excuse me, there's only one nucleus per muscle cell. But the unique thing about smooth muscle, it does not have those striations. They don't have the stripes that run up and down. Instead, it just looks like a sample of smooth, consistent tissue that runs left and right. Now let's also talk about the nervous tissue. This is the fourth main type of tissue that we have in our body. Nervous tissue is found in your brain, spinal cord, nerves, and it's what sends and receives impulses. Now, when we go to the nervous system unit, we will talk about the parts of a nerve cell, a neuron. We'll talk about how a neuron has a cell body and an axon, and how this neuron actually sends the message down the axons to another unit. But what I want you just to be able to do for this unit is to recognize it under a microscope. What we're looking at here in this picture is the red blobs are neurons. These are the cells that actually transmit the messages. The yellow stuff in between the red blobs is also nerve tissue, but we call that supporting cells. They kind of help the neurons do their job. But so when you look at the red blobs, the neurons, you can see the cell body, and you can see connected to the cell body is the axon, the long stick thing that allows this neuron to send the message to another unit. Here we have an axon. You can see the neuron. That's what this black stuff is. This is the neuron communicating its message to a muscle. To me, this is smooth muscle because you can't really see any striations. But so in this microscope slide, you see two types of tissues. You see muscle tissue and you see neuron tissue. And this is how neurons communicate to muscles, and that they just literally stop right there on the muscle so that it can communicate its message to that muscle's fiber. Now, what happens when this tissue gets injured? Let's say you got cut, or you fell down, or you were in a car accident. How does the tissue fix itself? Well, there's really two ways. It can regenerate. It can just simply replace the cells that were damaged by cells that look exactly the same. Or it can go through a process called fibrosis, in which the tissues that were damaged are replaced by dense fibrous connective tissue, or what you and I like to call scar tissue. Now, things that tend to regenerate easily is your epithelial tissue. Think about your skin. When you cut your arm, usually 2 or 3 weeks later, that injury has repaired itself completely, and the tissue looks like it did originally. This also happens in your bone and in your fibrous connective tissue. So those types of tissues usually just can regrow and form itself right back to where it was before. Your skeletal muscle, on the other hand, if that was injured, if that was involved in an injury, you're likely going to develop some sort of scar tissue, dense connective tissue in replace of that skeletal muscle. Also, things that don't really regenerate very well and will likely form some scar tissue is your cardiac muscle tissue and your nervous tissue. So one thing you should realize is that if you damage your nerve tissue, that's usually not going to grow back, right? Or same with your cardiac muscle tissue. If you have a heart attack and part of your heart muscle dies, it's going to be replaced by scar tissue and not likely be able to regenerate and form new tissue back to the way it was originally. Alrighty, you guys, this concludes the notes all about tissues. I want to encourage you to study, 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 because your first practical of the year is coming up, and you will be expected to be able to identify all these 4 different types of tissues: epithelial, connective, muscle, nervous, and the different types of each of those tissues. You can do it. Just study, study, study. Good luck.